So we refer to that as our Zoom collect. So welcome, ladies. Tell us about your program.
Larry, we have a slideshow if we can do that. Can we do that?
By all means.
Okay, now that would be, now do you have to share co-host or can I just share?
You can just share.
Okay, great.
You
So
have the power.
Thank you. I love that. I am going to go to my show here. And this is going to feel like buckle up because we wanted to be sure that there was time for questions at the end. Sometimes that is as effective or more effective than the whole process. And so now let's see if I can do this with my mouse. Can I do that with my mouse? Yes. So just quickly, Peak is Parents of Estranged Adult Kids, and Faye Avis is the founder. Some of you may know him as Russ Crabtree. He's written a number of books. And Russ and I pounded this out together, and I'm now the director. And Aemina is our director of program development. So
you know, you're not sharing your slides.
I'm not. How do I do it any different?
You're on your, you have two monitors?
No, I don't.
Sure, you said share screen.
Yeah.
Let me, could that be because let me see if I can get back to where I was with you guys. So could that be because this is one Google screen and my presentation's on another Google screen?
Shouldn't be. If you want to email it to me, I can share it.
I can share if you.
No.
Oh, there it goes.
All right. All right. I'm not the most technically savvy, but that worked. So now let's see if I can do my slideshow. There we go. And so I will not even begin to try and give you any theology behind these two offerings, except to say that the stories are included in a book that I'm going to share with you at the end, and that these are two stories of estrangement that are in Genesis. So being able to recognize it in the Bible and how it's addressed and what it looks like is an important factor for pastors. Many times people will read the book I'm going to suggest, Absalom's Wounds, and come away and say, I didn't even realize that was an example of estrangement. So I think there are some options out there that might be helpful once we get this underway. So family estrangement is something that is emerging more and more as days go by. This is from 2020, and it's from the New York Times. But this is one of multitudes at this point that have now articles and research that's been done. So let me start out by just talking about what parental estrangement is, and I'm going to start by telling you what it isn't. So it's not the typical teenagers who regularly just don't like you. It's not the challenges of the poor decision making that kids make in their early 20s when they're out looking for a Corvette and purchasing a used Corvette, and they haven't asked you and you're upset. That's not this estrangement. And it's not the garden variety stuff we get at the holidays either. So parental estrangement is really this is our working definition, and it happens. It's the communication of all sorts is severed because either the adult has made the decision to withdraw, or the adult child has made the decision to withdraw from the relationship, or the parent has found it necessary to establish a boundary that the adult child has declined to honor. And I would ask you to guess, but it takes too long because we want to get through this. So I'm just going to give you the statistic. 95% of the estrangements are when the adult child has made the decision to withdraw. And we're also not talking about estrangement that has anything to do with violence, abuse, substance abuse.
Yeah.
We're talking about estrangements that are based on emotional difficulties and dysfunction in the family. So that cuts a whole lot of estrangements out, so that we're looking at things that I would never suggest anyone who's come from a violent relationship go back to it or be around that unhealthy system. The systems we're talking about are the systems that are emotionally dysfunctional. And so what we're looking at, just to give you an idea of the population you're dealing with in your church, adulthood begins around the age of 28, and we use that number because it's the average age for marriage and first children in the United States. So this means that the estrangement can begin for some parents by the time they're in their mid-50s. It's 1 in 8 is the estrangement number for people over the age of 55. 1 in 8 parents over the age of 55, 12% of our population, is estranged by their adult child, maybe more. With the ripple effect, that means that 27% of American population has some sort of an estrangement going on in their family outside of divorce, not including divorce. Estrangement's most frequent for parents in their 70s and 80s, and the normal process where our adult children would begin taking responsibility for their aging parents, helping them shovel their sidewalk, making sure that they have what they need in the house, running errands for medications, that sort of thing, is curtailed. That responsibility then becomes difficult because parents have to find someone who can do this for them or pay someone to do that for them. So with that being said, I want to just look at some of the commonality of it. So as I said before, about 12% or 5 million people in the United States are suffering the effects of this estrangement. And there's some reasons we're not aware of this number. And if you look out over your congregations, if you're dealing with the typical congregation right now who's mostly over 55, you can pretty much count on 1 out of 8 people sitting in the pew has been estranged by an adult child.
Oh,
The stigma is one reason people don't talk about it. The myth is that if your child has walked away from you, there must be something wrong with you as a parent. That is not the case. There's shame involved because then the parents feel like failures and they don't want you to know. And the denial, parents think that estrangement is more temporary than it actually is. And that's because a lot of estrangements, that the way they begin is with what we call a dance. And so the kid sort of pulls away for a couple weeks and the parents don't hear from them and they're like, oh, that's just how they are. Then they come back, they're kind of testing how they can tolerate that distance from their parents. The next time they'll be like, oh yeah, we had an argument, we haven't heard from them in a month, but that'll change. And then they come back together. But the truth of the matter is that less than 10% of parental estrangement cases reconcile. And so you've got people dealing with hurt day after day, year after year. And the last reason we're not aware is that we're not asking. Faith communities, counselors, doctors, lawyers, caregivers, people who are planning end of life issues are not asking the question. And there is an impact, and people don't regularly offer that up. So I'm going to talk about the factors that contribute to parental estrangement. These probably will not be any surprise to you. And so what I usually will ask is, let's Well, let me give you one example here, and then I'm going to ask you if there's anything on here you want to ask me about instead of me going over each one, because some of them are pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to just ask you to ask me. But you've got these situations where a father has abandoned their child, say at 2 years old. They just walked out. Later on, that child becomes an adult. They go on a search for the missing father. They find him and they develop a close relationship. Now you think about that, and then you've got this other situation where there's a father who's there for everything, reads to the class in kindergarten, goes to concerts, goes to class play sports events, goes through divorce, and then the kid ends the relationship. And that father was there for everything. So figuring out what is exactly at play is not easy. Divorce and remarriage is one that we know. About 70% of people who are estranged have also been divorced. So we know it's a high factor. Is there anything on here that you would want to ask about before we flip over to another topic, another slide?
Yeah, not sure how to ask this. Is there statistics or a prevalence of anorexia and estrangement from parents, or would that just be grouped together with mental health?
That's a mental health issue, and yes, that is something that we have seen is the adult child that has estranged the parent is dealing with either anorexia or bulimia.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, I am going to push through then. So what becomes important for us are the impacts in the work that I do. We have got it's a trauma, for one thing. It's an emotional trauma that can result in isolation for all of the reasons we mentioned before, stigma and shame. The emotional pain, I cannot even begin to describe what crosses over our offices for people who are in this kind of pain. The grief is really weird because it's like someone being a missing in action soldier. You don't know what's going to happen, if they're ever going to come back. So there's a lot of different impacts. The medical problem impacts are amazing. People do not realize the medical problems that they endure or that are exacerbated as a result of the stress of estrangement. I have a whole presentation on that for different populations who are learning about this. But here's the first place that I would mention what clergy, a direct thing that clergy can do, and that is to explore with the parent how the estrangement is affecting their life. And so this can help them recognize how badly they need to get into something that will help them recover instead of hanging on and hoping and hoping and hoping for reconciliation. So just, being able to ask them, how has your mood been? Have you had swings of depression or high anxiety? How was your sleep? What's your thought like? Are you preoccupied? Do you find that it's hard to focus on things? Are they having emotional outbursts? So those are some things that you can ask to help a parent recognize what's really happening. The relationships portion of this. How is the relationship with their spouse or their partner if they are in a relationship? How are they doing with their own siblings? What about your children and the siblings that may not be estranged? That's another ripple effect where a break in relationship can tend to happen. Do you get to see your grandchildren? Sometimes it's called zero contact, when people will not let you have anything to do with them or their children. And then sometimes their spiritual life, their faith community, have they walked away from their faith community? You might find that out if someone has stopped attending church, that this is a part of the reason why. Has it affected their spiritual practice, their relationship with God, or their own self-image. So there's a lot of things you can ask, not in a way to be probing or pushing, but to also be able to find out, help them recognize the degree, the many, many places that it is affecting them. When I do medical timeline for people, and there's a whole process to that, but the last thing we put on the timeline is when the estrangement happened. They're so surprised to see what has happened after the estrangement and realize that the estrangement is having an impact on their medical health. And it affects life planning, sense of purpose, all of that. So I'm just going to switch over to this one piece, and Amina's going to pick it up from here for a while. So Aemina, you tell me when you want me to flip the screen, okay?
Sure. So as Keli just mentioned, there's a lot of impacts that happen in trauma, and parental estrangement is trauma. If you can just imagine having a child, and then, as Keli said, you have no idea. There are parents who have no idea if their child is alive or dead. They have no idea if their child has gotten married, if their child has gotten divorced, if their child has had children, if their grandchildren have children. So for those who have zero contact, which are most of the people we are working with, there is such a degree of grief and stress in every single moment. And Faye, our founder, has had both a child die and a child estranged. And he has said that the estrangement is more painful than the child he lost to death, because it's that never knowing. And as we journey with our peak parents, I am truly astounded by the level of trauma that is happening. So the chronic pain, the impaired immune system, as Keli was mentioning, the medical timeline, the inability to concentrate, all of these other things, also being aware that the rate of suicidality, at least suicidal ideation, is high in these parents. And that is another source of shame. It's shameful to have those feelings in our communities and our society. And it's certainly shameful in a lot of church spaces. So it's not something we can always share about. Being isolated. So one of the things that happens is you may have people, as Keli said, people may pull away from their spiritual community, but you may have people who are coming who just seem like they're not as connected. And one of the things that we have found out is from many, many people, they don't feel like they can tell their pastor. They don't feel like they can bring this up in church because, again, it's that shame and stigma. Well, what did you do? Well, if you had to have done something wrong. You're a terrible parent. And also some of the platitudes. Well, God has a plan. Well, everything will be okay. And what kind of a plan would it ever be to be estranged from your child? And so these feelings of isolation and inability to be with other people are another sign of the trauma. Would you go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
One of the things that I think is most important is remembering that trauma impedes our imagination. So when we are traumatized, the fact is your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex totally offline. Trauma feels like it's continuing. And in this case, it is, because there isn't an end, but you have to somehow live in recovery with the unknown. And trauma impedes our imagination. It stops us from conceiving of anything other than the current crushing pain and shame and hopelessness. And when we can't imagine a way forward, we can't imagine a God who longs for our wholeness. We can't imagine we're part of the children of God, because our ability to imagine anything other than the pain and shame is impeded. There's amazing neurobiological research on this. And for me, tying this into what Christina Cleveland said, that imagination is theology, we can only believe what we can imagine. I think this is where we as a church in the business of soul, this is where we're called to speak. We can imagine a life that maybe doesn't look like what you wanted it to or what you hoped, but how do we stand with you while you create a space to imagine what your life will be now, and that your life still has worth and meaning? One of the first questions we ask people, what do you do for a living? Second question, do you have children? Well, for a lot of these people, they are hitting that age where they're retiring. And now how do they answer the question about children? So then how are they seen and how do they embody being beloved children of God? How do they embody their soul and their authentic self? And this is how we can live into that mirroring. This is how we can see the imago Dei in another person and help journey with them in trauma recovery. Kelly?
All righty. You know, it's when you think about it too, we project our own generational stuff onto this because it's happening in the millennial generation. And so when somebody tells us, say a 60, a 50, 55-year-old person tells us that their child has estranged them, our generation was raised like no child would walk away from their parent for no reason. And that may be a truth in some ways, but what's missing for them is a functional relationship. And that does not mean one way. It's got to go both ways. And so that's our own generation can put a whole lot of baggage on that as we think about it. So I just want to take a look at not necessarily a biblical perspective in per se in a theological sense, but there's two approaches to estrangement. And so we look at reconciliation and restoration, and that's what everybody pushes for, longs for, desires, and would be the perfect outcome. But because the reconciliation rate is so low and people are hurting so much, we look at the release and recovery portion of that. Pete wants people to recover from this estrangement. And so there are the two stories, obviously, you can recognize here that show those two things, but how do you put that into action? And so one of the things you can do as a pastor that would help is you can normalize this for parents, know the statistic, to be able to say to them, you're not alone. This happens to a lot of people. You can normalize that for them, and you can help them to understand then that it isn't rare and that it does happen to the best of parents, people who have done their very best. When I'm teaching this to other groups, what I'll say is nobody holds that beautiful little baby bundle in their arms when they're born and looks it directly in the eyes and says, I'm just going to be the worst parent I can possibly be. We don't do that. Our heart isn't there. And nobody expects this. You go to a wedding and you see a couple and you think in your head, well, statistics tell us they have a 50-50 chance at being together. We don't think that about our kids. That's not what we think of. It's not natural. So to think this way. So normalizing it can really, really help somebody. Also helping them to recognize that estrangement is not a measure of their worth, their competence, or any of that. It is what happened. It's not unusual. And we can take a closer look at that. So being able to help them with that, and even to be able to say to somebody, a lot of parents today have adult children who've curtailed their communication or just completely cut them off. Has that happened with any of your children? If you are dealing with someone where you suspect it, how do you suspect it? Well, you've heard someone say that they have 4 kids and you stop to think about it and wow, they only ever tell stories about 3. Or they have stopped talking about one of their children. So there might be some telltale signs that estrangement has happened in a family or is in process. So I want to look at a side-by-side comparison between the release and recovery and the reconciliation and restoration. And so the difference that you see in the relationship is that, for the recovery person who needs to be considering recovery work is withdrawn. And the person who hasn't, there's some engagement there. Polarization, people are good, someone is all good or all bad. But if there's going to be any hope for reconciliation and restoration, there has to be a self-awareness that I might have played a role in this. I'm willing to take a look at that. And nobody is all good and all bad in this family or in our relationship. in the recovery one, their parents are telling you, oh, they're telling me that I owe them of this, or I owe them that because of all the years that we didn't do this or we didn't do that. So there's this emotional debt that's being held over their head. But in the other one where there's hope for reconciliation, they'll say, well, no, they've told me they forgive me for this. We're still quite distant. So you can see by this list that there is quite a bit of difference between the person who should be considering recovery instead of hoping for reconciliation. And the good thing about recovery, the recovery process, is if someone engages in that recovery process, they are better set up for a healthy reconciliation. And there is such a thing as an unhealthy or unstable reconciliation. So, you've got the separation here, you've got restoration here. And here, asymmetric power. You've got the children have all the power if they have made this separation. And it's like, nope, until you do this or you do that, then we're not coming anywhere near you. Where in some place where there's hope for reconciliation, there's some mutuality in that. Like, well, I'll work on my boundaries a little bit if you want to work on yours. So you can see the differences here as we go. So you've got, you're trying to assess, you're trying to figure out what they need. How are you going to resource them if they're looking for recovery or if they're ready and positioned for reconciliation? And so between all of these things where there's withdrawal and thinking in black and white and all of these other parts, they're also still in significant pain. They're finding that their efforts to reconnect are either rebuffed or used against them. And that's a whole nother piece of wax about people who have tried to reconcile and then their efforts have been used against them. They don't know how to navigate living in estrangement. And then bad behaviors can set in. How are they coping? Have they begun to overeat? Are they withdrawing and their health is suffering? Are they drinking? Have they started drinking and never did? Have they returned to bad habits, gambling, smoking, anything at all like that? So thinking about it is important, but most parents out there who are struggling with estrangement have never even thought that recovery was an option. They never have heard of it. So, talking about a little bit more about ministering to estranged parents. If we don't offer release and recovery as an option, we can, it can feed into all of the different exhaustions, emotional exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion, financial exhaustion. Many parents have just taken themselves to the brink of financial ruin, thinking if I give them this money this time, they'll come back. If I give them this money, they'll come back. They get just exhausted. And then everybody's got to, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Take the high road, go bang on their door and tell them they have to be in contact with you. And that stuff does not work. They feel defective. They feel isolated. They're ignoring their medical problems. They don't even recognize them as connected to the estrangement. They're not living into any purpose by serving other people. So it's really some huge impacts that get carried on that have longer impacts. The next thing that you can do, you've normalized and you kind of help them assess whether they're ready for recovery or reconciliation, is you can help cultivate hope. Helping the estranged parent to understand that they can only change themselves. We can't force the child to do anything that they don't want to do, and that's only going to make the estrangement worse. So taking responsibility for their own well-being is important, and help them understand that sometimes that estrangement can make you feel crazy. Like, why did they do this? I don't understand their rationale. 66% of children who have estranged their parents are able to say, yes, I have told my parents why I'm estranging them. And 60% of estranged parents will say, no, I don't know why. I don't know why. So, our faith community can help restore people in these feelings like, wow, these people, they don't treat me like I'm crazy. I feel at home here. They make me feel comfortable here. So helping people to recognize the hope that is existent in their community, their church community, and recognizing that turning over their decision to recover um, into the care of God and how they understand God is important. And again, this is a really quick presentation. In our longer presentation, we have testimonies upon testimonies upon testimonies about parents who have engaged in recovery and how it has helped them. So I'm going to end this by just giving you some resources so that you can share them with any parents that you might be ministering to. And then we're going to stop sharing screen so we can answer questions. So let me just say that offering or helping with resource therapists, if you have any that you can refer to, there are not a lot of them who are trained in peak yet. This is a new movement. But therapists who are trained in systems theory, family systems theory are people that you want to get to. And the best therapists that you can find for that are looking for marriage and family therapists because they're basically trained in this. Connecting them with other estranged parents. Do you have a group at your church? Can you start a group at your church? We can help you with doing that. Bringing in professionals from within the congregation. There might be some resources there if you have lawyers or estate planners who understand peak or want to. If you can hook us up with any of those people who might want us to come and train them, we'll be glad to do that. Books and videos that address this. There are books I'm going to share with you that you can help resource them with. But also we have a YouTube channel. If you go to the YouTube and do a search on parents of estranged adult kids, you'll get a few different channels, but our channel will pop up there. And we have a lot of videos that help them understand estrangement and the difference between recovery and reconciliation. Pastoral support, of course, whatever sort of pastoral care you have in place, and encouraging involvement in a support group like Peak. We have online groups. We are slow for summer. Most of our leaders are taking some time to sort of recover themselves from having groups all year. We are having a retreat September 8th, 9th, and 10th in Greenville, South Carolina for estranged parents. And then our groups will start again after the 10th. So that's an option. So here are two of the books. This is Peak, a resource for recovery. It's written by Faye. And then there is the daily readings. And this is a book that they can use as a daily devotional. And it's faith-based and in the Christian Christian system of theology. But there's a group experience. There's in these groups, they're anonymous. They share their common experience. And we do things like book studies, topical studies. We have a couples group. We have a trauma group. We have a therapist-led group. So there's a lot of different supports there for them. So the affirmations that they're going to hear that I hope that you can also see as important are that relationships between parents and adult children are voluntary. And that is really hard for some people to wrap their heads around. But our culture no longer has a need for parents and children to stay bound to each other for the family farm or the family business. And as adult to adult relationship, all of our adult to adult relationships are voluntary. We also affirm that estrangement can be a reasonable solution to a currently unsolvable problem. It happens and the problems can be resolved, but there has to be some work done. And the healing begins by getting out of isolation. And sometimes a group is the safest place to go to come out of isolation. Another piece of it that we encourage are participants in is that parents are the biological instrument of their children's existence. But if their faith is based in Christianity, their true parent is a spiritual source, wherever that comes from for your child. And as Christians, we call God. Understanding that too, that feelings like, oh, I feel this, I feel that. Well, feelings can change as we restructure our thinking, and we help parents to do that. And on the things that you can offer to them, like normalizing this and helping them with resources, can help them restructure their thinking. Parents have to take responsibility for their own well-being. It affects the best of parents, and the recovery process can improve a lot of things. So here's just quick, I'm not even gonna leave this up long enough for you to read it, but there's 6 testimonies here from parents that have written to us to tell us how peak has affected their life. So here are some service for clergy and lay leaders. And so addressing it in your ministry. Again, I have a resource at the end that you can take a look at. Senior adult programming is not something that everybody is able to come up with, like, what can we offer seniors? So this is certainly one of those things that would be addressing that community. Include estrangement when you do the services of solace or your Blue Christmas. People don't mention estrangement when they talk about the losses that people have endured, but estrangement is a huge loss. And then balancing your messaging between reconciliation, the hope for reconciliation and restoration, and the idea that it might need to be a release and recovery process. So just to think about, you might want to start a support group. You might want to be able to reach out to adult living centers. But developing a referral network of professional caregivers is important. Who can you refer people to in your community that you know can handle this? And again, we have done trainings for estate planners, financial planners, lawyers, all sorts of folks. And if there's a group that you think would benefit from having us come and share this with them, please let us know about it, or let them know about us. The opportunities for estranged parents, again, I'm going to go through this quickly. And you might have these sitting right in your congregation, or that you have access to: financial advisors, estate attorneys, care advocates, healthcare professionals who will screen for estrangement as underlying stress factors, mental health professionals, clergy who understand family estrangement, are not blaming that just to the parents, and then peak facilitators. So here's the resources, and then I'm going to turn this over to you guys for questions. This is the Parents of Estranged Adult Kids book that Faye wrote. This book, Relation Snip, is the book that I wrote, and it's about recovery and the process of recovery. These are a couple more. This is The Journey. It's daily readings for Lent and Easter. And this is Reflections. This is daily readings that are written for people who would not identify necessarily as Christian, but the growing group of spiritual, but not religious. And so it gives you an opportunity to share with them without feeling like they're getting something that's going to be explicitly Christian. And this is the resource for the clergy and congregation. It's Absalom's Wounds. It's written by Faye, and it's a number of stories from the Bible about the estrangement process and how it was handled and what it looked like. And this can be really helpful for parents, even if you're using it just for preaching, to normalize this and say, see, it happens. It happens to people, the best of people. And, you know, when we think about how so many times the people will use the story of David as a way of normalizing our human frailty, and yet God still used David. And so being able to normalize parental estrangement and help people to understand that you know, you too can be just as good a parent as anyone else and still be dealing with this, is a way to minister to them. So I'm going to leave this at this moment open for questions, and hopefully Aemina and I, between the two of us, can answer whatever questions you might have on the topic.
Yeah, hi Kelly. Can you talk a bit about relationships with grandchildren? When one is estranged as a parent from one's child?
So we are, it's not uncommon at all when you have an adult child who has estranged their parent to also have them cut off access to the grandchildren. So that it's really a ripple effect in that case. And sometimes children are open, the adult child is open to letting the grandchildren be exposed to the grandparent. I've had a number of people who estranged their parent tell me they were rotten parents, but they're good grandparents. But the reconciliation process is really non-existent to go with your grandchildren because they don't have any power in the system. So in order for that to happen, I would think that that would probably have to be facilitated between the parent and the adult child to allow that to happen. Because if the adult child is giving zero contact, it's really going to end up in their lap. They hold the power in that situation.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Are there some clues as to when somebody is ready to have this conversation? I'm thinking of a couple I know that are probably still in the things like this don't happen to people like us stage. So,
Yeah. If you know about it, then it's okay to talk about it. If they have been free enough to tell you that, I would say that you probably have to go into it with a lot of gentle curiosity, just to say, tell me how you guys are doing. Did you know that there's this this source that you can look at? I'd be glad to share it with you if you're interested. Um, tell me how you think this happened. Do you know? The first thing that people tend to do is feel very bewildered. And so processing it out loud, especially if it's a new estrangement, is really helpful for them. They're not going to get answers, but at least they're processing it out loud and not in their head with somebody who's willing to listen, which is really hard for people to find someone who's even willing to listen after they hear the story the first time.
I think the other thing that's really helpful, Larry, is that I was talking to a clergy person last month who said, oh my gosh, this is happening to me. And when I gave them the statistics, they were just blown away. And so I think, as Kelly has mentioned a few times, trying to normalize it, not that it makes it okay. Normalizing something doesn't make it okay. It just means you are not alone in this. You are not the only person. This isn't a 0.01%. And I think being able to bring that forward really helps open the conversation. I agree, if you know anything, I think you can approach it tenuously and with curiosity, but I think it's really helpful to be able to immediately say, hey, this is awful. It's 12% of the population. And that's of what we know. And I think that's another thing. There are some cultural differences. And so we don't have as much information about minority groups because they often have very different familial structures. And so that's a whole other conversation to have at some point, is how this impacts differently based on your race, region, religion, all those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
any other questions or comments? I think this is just an incredibly important topic, and probably for the. Hi, Naomi.
So I had somebody walk in while this was going on. And I told her what it was about. And she said, these are the grandchildren of her husband, not her grandchildren. If these grandchildren ever come in and ask you to see me, tell them no.
There you go.
So, I mean, but it's broken. I mean, they're not her grandchildren, and so I thought that was interesting. I had to share it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not as uncommon as people think it is, but there's nobody addressing it. People aren't talking about how do we minister to this? What are the resources that we can offer to people like this? And if that were the only ministry you had, you could continue to have people in there constantly for just that ministry.
I just want to highlight one other thing. One of the things that we see a lot is third-party estrangement. So someone is influencing the estrangement. So a best friend, a spouse, a therapist, a clergy person. And I think it's really helpful if you know the story to be able to have that conversation as well. Don't you think, Keli?
It is. It is the most common type of estrangement, is one where there's a third party leveraging, encouraging, supporting, pulling away from the adult, from your parents. And so that can make the parent feel twice as powerless because they feel like there's 2 against 1. Happens a lot when somebody marries. They marry somebody who encourages them to stay separate from their parents or to push them away. And then the parents are devastated because it's a child and an in-law, and then it's going to probably trickle down to their children. So a third party is many times involved.
Now I bring that up just because I think it's another good conversation to have in premarital conversations and counseling before we get to the estrangement part. But I think it's another point to remember, like, this is happening. And so if there are conflicts, if there are issues, how might we deal with them? Because as Keli said, so much it's the breakdown of communication more than anything. And so if we can do a little on the beginning as well, I think it would be good for our souls.
Well, I think asking in premarital consultations, do you have any people in your family who are estranged from each other, is important, because it becomes a pattern in families generationally, even separate from divorce. I know divorce can come in generationally, but also just estrangement, like siblings. How many of us as children noticed, gee, whenever we have a family thing, Aunt Susie and Aunt Sally are never there at the same time. And then you get older and you're like, oh, people are saying they never got along. They literally never got along. And so being able to pass that on to the people that you're counseling for premarital counseling and saying, look, this is a risk factor for your marriage.
Anyone have anything else?
Was anybody,
Keli, thank you so much.
was anybody surprised by the statistic? The one, yeah. No, one's no, one yeah. It's a high number. And when you think about it, when you look out over your congregation, if you asked, every 8th person to stand up, and Aemina and I did a presentation 2 weeks ago in Saratoga at a care provider, care coordinator sort of group for New York. And I counted the number of people in the room before we got up to speak. And I said, by statistically, there's 10 people in this room who are estranged from their adult children. And by the end, when people come up and talk to the presenters afterwards, between Aemina and I, we had 4 people who come up and said, I'm one of the 10 in the room. So there's a lot. Scott, we can't hear you.
Try to be polite. Larry, you'll send out, besides the recording, all the list of the other resources and books and such that they were,
Yes.
or the presentation itself for that matter, whatever they think is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, because we have people in our church, the ones that, are saints, and you wonder what in the world's going on you know,
Yeah.
that's caused it, because it's like,
Mhm.
anyway, yeah. So like you say, you never know.
If you want to minister to people and really have a good background on this, I would suggest you read the Resource for Recovery and RelationSNP, because they come from two different directions on what it is and how a parent can deal with recovery. And if you know what they need to do for recovery, that can be helpful for them. And that informs you on the population that you're dealing with. I hope this was helpful for everybody in some.
All right.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Walking wounded in every congregation, so.
Yeah, true,
Well,
true.
let's end with a blessing. This is a poem prayer by Anne Hillman. We look with uncertainty beyond the old choices for clear-cut answers to a softer, more permeable aliveness, which at every moment is at the brink of death. Something new is being born in us, if but we let it. We stand at a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, and learning to love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Friends,
much.
The Lord be with you.
And also with
Absolutely.
you.
And also with you.
I know.
Thank you very much.